Laura's birthday. I'll describe a strange episode from my childhood. My father thinks I'm a fantasist. My best friend diagnoses paranoia. You can't really bring this kind of thing up with a therapist. In the early 2000s, my parents' business started doing well, and they enrolled me in a private academy. The kind of school that taught well by regional standards, but where the discipline among the rich kids was no better than at the public school across town. In third grade, a girl was brought into our class. Her name was Laura. According to the teacher, she'd been homeschooled until then. People tried to befriend her at first, but she wasn't interested. She spoke in a near whisper, sat at a separate desk, didn't go to the cafeteria or gym class, didn't participate in anything. Her face had an expression I can only describe as old. Not sad exactly, more like exhausted in a way that didn't fit a child. She was constantly writing in a small notebook. I looked over her shoulder a few times and couldn't read anything. Tiny handwriting, mostly numbers and small diagrams. In 5th grade, a group of 4 boys started targeting her. 3 of them were the typical kind of kids who'd grown up hearing they could do anything. And the 4th, a kid named Igor, came from a less comfortable background and played the role of their follower. In elementary school, they'd been kept in check. In middle school, they came off the leash. Their usual target was the class outcast, an overweight kid everyone called Tubbs. But when he was absent, they switched to Laura. One afternoon, Igor and the group leader started playing keep-away with her pencil case. She chased it back and forth for a couple of minutes, then slipped and hit her head on a desk corner. She didn't cry. She made a quiet sound, almost a whimper. The boys panicked, and the teacher arrived in time to drag them to the principal's office. The next day, our homeroom teacher ran a class session on bullying, the standard speech, the guilty parties sitting with their heads down. At the end, she suggested we visit Laura in the hospital. No volunteers. She started assigning people. That's how I ended up on the list. Apparently, I picked a bad moment to be playing my Game Boy. A few girls and I went to the hospital. After that, Laura began inviting me over. That's where things got strange. Her house was in a private residential development on the edge of town. From the outside, it looked like the other large houses there, except for the fence, at least 10 feet tall, which was unusual even by the standards of wealthy neighborhoods. Inside, there was nothing obviously wrong at first glance. Lawn, flower beds, renovated interiors, electronics, but no toys, no children's books, no swing set, no outdoor furniture for kids. We were 11, so you wouldn't expect dolls or toy cars, but no one actually threw all of that out at 11. The house gave the impression of being inhabited entirely by adults. There were a lot of computers. At that time, even in a comfortable family, having more than one was unusual. I remember thinking about setting up a network game, the way they did at the computer cafes, but there were no games on any of the machines. The desktops were covered in software I didn't recognize. Laura's parents were the strangest part. They looked like actors in a commercial, tall, blue-eyed, tanned. I assumed at first they were athletes, but they behaved oddly, permanent smiles. Whatever you said to them, they nodded and said, "Yes, yes." The first time I came over, I asked where the bathroom was. They answered by telling me Laura was upstairs and thanking me for coming. I asked again. Same response. Only on the 3rd attempt did the mother react, but instead of answering, she just pointed silently toward the hall. Other adults appeared in the house from time to time. They looked like Laura's parents, same smiling, good-looking type. They never spoke in my presence. When I appeared, they moved quickly into closed rooms. On one visit, it seemed like the whole house was full of them, and all of them were watching me. The strangeness wasn't limited to the house. Since I often stayed late, I frequently walked home from Laura's in the dark. On several occasions, I noticed a glowing sphere in the sky above me. It looked like a paper lantern, but it moved as if following me, keeping pace like a drone. Remarkably, in all my walks to and from that development, I never once encountered any of the dogs that normally roamed the neighborhood, or any of the drunks that populated the surrounding streets. One evening, as I was leaving, I glanced back at the house. In the attic window, I saw children, 2 boys and a girl, roughly my age, looking down at me. We made eye contact for maybe 3 seconds. Then they ran. Laura's mother appeared immediately and drew the curtain, still smiling. The strangest moment of all was Laura's birthday. She called me the same afternoon. No social media then, not even instant messaging. Laura just called and told me to come. Her voice was quiet, as always, but there was something in it that didn't leave room to refuse. I didn't want to go, especially after the faces in the window, but I went anyway. Her parents led me upstairs with their usual expressions. Laura's room had a table with soda, wafers, and a small cake, but the whole thing felt less like a birthday party and more like a poorly staged school event. The guests were 3 girls from our class, the top student, Tubbs, 1 other boy from the parallel class, and Igor. Apparently, his father had sent him to make amends. Laura's parents and a few other adults stationed themselves in the corners of the room, smiles fixed in place. The moment I sat down, they began singing in perfect unison. "Happy birthday, Laura." The sound made my skin crawl. It stopped quickly. Laura blew out the candles, and I ate some cake. After the cake, Laura's mother stepped to the center of the room and announced a game. The premise was simple. Guess the card. Boring, I thought. Years later, looking it up, I recognized what they were. Zener cards. The same ones researchers used in ESP experiments. We were being tested. After that came a board game, more of an intelligence quiz. The girls were visibly miserable. Tubbs, though, nearly kept pace with the class brain. He was genuinely sharp, just worn down by years of being treated otherwise. The final game was a version of Blind Man's Bluff. Igor was chosen to go first. They blindfolded him and, this part still bothers me, hit him with what looked like lightweight rods while he tried to catch someone. The game played out on the ground floor, where the rooms formed a kind of maze lined with mirrors. He caught no one. By the end, he looked nothing like the boy who had thrown Laura's pencil case. He was close to tears. We all went home unharmed. After that, I decided I was done visiting Laura. Whatever help she offered with homework wasn't worth it. She became insistent, calling every day, asking me to come back, telling me I'd scored highest on the card guesses. I held firm. Eventually, she stopped calling. The others drifted away too, except for Tubbs, who kept going, and Igor, remarkably, became almost servile around her, the way he'd once been around the boys who bullied him. After 9th grade, Laura disappeared. Teachers claimed not to know where she'd gone. I went back to the development once. The house had been sold to a well-connected local businessman who knew nothing about the previous owners. I searched for her name online and found nothing. Then one day, on the street, a man grabbed my arm. He wasn't homeless exactly, more like someone who had reached the bottom but still had a roof and could occasionally clean himself up. It was Tubbs. He held onto my sleeve and talked about Laura. Said she had used the people who followed her, that experiments had been conducted on him, that kind of thing. I was uneasy, but I listened. I tried to write some of it down. Then an older woman appeared, his mother, and led him away. I later found out he'd been on the psychiatric register for years. I looked for Igor after that. I found him. We won't be speaking. He's now a senior official in the Moscow city government, an unusual trajectory for a kid from a provincial town. I keep thinking about the question I can't answer. What would have happened to me if I'd kept going back? The meteorologist's day. I was 5 or 6 at the time. No school yet. I'd been too sick to go to kindergarten, and my sister, who usually stayed home with me on those days, had caught the same thing. So my mother took me to work with her. I was thrilled. My mother wasn't a clerk in some government office or a cashier or any of the other ordinary things. My mother was a meteorologist. Capital M. If you've never been inside a weather station, find a way to visit one. The atmosphere is unlike anything else. Instruments of unclear purpose crowd the work tables, humming, clicking, ticking, performing their vital and completely incomprehensible functions. In the far corner, there's always a mercury column, and here it's not a figure of speech, but an actual meter-long tube filled with real mercury. The ceiling height anemometers, the cloud height sensor you press your face into, breathing the warm rubber smell, the beam of invisible light reaching into the sky above you. Barographs ticking in the corner, daily and weekly versions side by side. Under the table, a radiometer capable of alerting the entire city to an approaching disaster. Weather stations are always set away from dense neighborhoods. City buildings trap heat and throw off temperature readings by 5 or 6 degrees. Ours sat in the oldest part of town, a district so old the locals still called it the Village, though it had officially been a city street since the 1930s. The whole city had grown outward from this spot. Across the road from the station stood an old stone church, the Church of the Dormition, reportedly built without a single nail. The only real tourist attraction in the whole county. The station ran around the clock. In the 90s, a meteorologist's pay wasn't much, but my mother never left the profession. That day, she'd come in for a full shift and brought me along. Over the course of the day, I played with a kitten, followed my mother out to the instrument yard, nearly got bowled over by a puppy, sawed actual firewood with a child's saw, helped my mother with the instruments by turning calibration dials under her guidance, and learned to identify cloud types from a 1950s atlas with extraordinary color photographs of the sky. By 9 in the evening, I dropped onto the couch in the break room, arms around the reluctant kitten, wrapped in an ancient sheepskin coat. I woke up deep in the night. Outside, an autumn thunderstorm was going full force. My mother was on the phone, transmitting a storm warning to the regional office. I could hear her reading out the weather codes, the abbreviated shorthand meteorologists use, a kind of language all its own. I started drifting off again under the rhythm of it. I woke a second time. The lights were out everywhere. The storm had quieted. Only the sound of rain on the windows. My mother was gone. I knew she'd probably stepped out to the instrument yard, but something about the darkness and the silence made me afraid in a way I couldn't explain. I went looking for the kitten. The kitten wasn't anywhere, and the outer door to the entryway was standing open. I knew this wasn't right. The station was strict about the doors. It sat in a rough part of town, not the kind of place you left unlocked at night. From outside, I could hear music. Strange music. As an adult, I'd describe it as 8-bit, the kind of sound an old game console made. But this was the early 90s, before MP3 players, before any of that, and I had no framework for it. Someone playing that in a near rural neighborhood at that hour on that equipment made no sense. I went outside, and immediately the fear disappeared. I walked to the fence and looked across the road. Above the church fence, maybe 3 meters up in the air, something was there. The thing itself was invisible, but its shape was unmistakable. Rain was hitting an invisible surface and running off it, the way water runs off a balloon or a plastic bag. except the object was roughly the size of 2 large watermelons, or maybe bigger. The space where rain couldn't fall glowed faintly violet and pulsed, expanding and contracting in time with the music. I stood and watched it, completely absorbed. Something warm was rising in my chest. I wanted to go to it, to run across the road, reach up, hold it. A hand grabbed my shoulder hard. My mother. She said something sharp, "Don't look," and dragged me back inside without another word. The next morning, several men arrived in military-style jackets. They moved through the station with long-handled instruments I didn't recognize, probing every surface. A woman doctor in a white coat examined me. Kind face, very red lipstick. The story wouldn't be worth telling, except for what happened recently. On the National Meteorologist's holiday, I brought that night up with my mother for the first time as an adult. She told me I drank too much and smoked too much, and that I'd had a bad dream. Then she showed me a Polaroid photograph of the kitten from that night. A striped orange tabby with yellow eyes. I remember a gray, long-haired kitten with green eyes. And my mother's station had no Polaroid camera. No one who worked there owned one. In the early 90s, in a small city, a Polaroid camera was the kind of thing only a factory director or a government intelligence officer could afford. I keep asking myself, did I actually stay inside that night? Or did I go to the sphere? Leviathan. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when work began on the deck of the research vessel. 2 men in dry suits climbed one after the other into the submersible, and as soon as they signaled readiness, the crane arm lifted the craft over the railing with deceptive ease. In under 10 minutes, it was gone beneath the surface. On the monitors, the image darkened as the submersible descended into the deep. Schools of fish followed briefly, drawn by the sound of the propellers. But none was willing to go as far down as the machine, and long before the sunlight finally failed, they had turned back. When the cameras went blind in the visible spectrum, the floodlights came on. "Surface, this is Sadco. Do you copy? Come in, surface." "Sadco, we read you clearly. Estimated time to target, 30 minutes. The target was a massive object discovered by accident. A military submarine on a training run had picked it up on sonar, resting on the ocean floor at nearly the maximum depth accessible to their submersible. A preliminary survey by remotely operated vehicle had established only that the object was artificial in origin. Samples taken from its surface had been identified as metallic alloys used primarily in aerospace applications, the kind of material used for satellite casings and spacecraft hulls. The specific alloy, though composed of elements known on Earth, was unknown to the scientific community, which led to speculation about extraterrestrial origin. The discovery was immediately classified. The official reason given for the research vessel's presence in these waters was the search for a ship sunk during World War II. The sonar found the object before the cameras did. On the monitor, a blurred image resolved, a cylindrical structure partially embedded in the ocean floor, more like an enormous pipe than any flying saucer. The two men exchanged a look. When the floodlights finally illuminated the find, they couldn't suppress their reaction. Whatever had built this thing for travel in the vacuum of space, it had held up remarkably well in the deep ocean. Only in the areas scorched during atmospheric entry had anything managed to take hold. And even there, it was only deep-sea tube worms finding purchase in the melted seams of the pale outer hull. The object was enormous, comparable in scale to the International Space Station. Along its flanks, massive solar panels hung, bent, and in some places, completely broken, bearing the same heat damage as the hull. The main cylinder was roughly uniform in diameter along its length, widening at the forward end into a great sphere, 2/3 of it buried in the underwater rock, and at the aft end into a regular pyramid shape that almost certainly housed the propulsion system, followed by nozzle bells that yawned like cave openings in the dark. Then, the floodlight beam caught the lettering on the hull, and both men lurched in their seats. In cold, artificial light, the Latin characters were perfectly legible. Leviathan. Leviathan, one of them breathed. Fitting name for something this size, the other murmured, more to himself than to his partner. They looked at each other, then both looked at the radio. It had been roughly 15 minutes since their last contact, in which they had confirmed the object's location. The name on the hull raised serious doubts about the extraterrestrial origin hypothesis, but the object had clearly been on the ocean floor for at least a century, and the material sample nearly ruled out any possibility that it had been built long before the birth of either man looking at it. "Could use Eric von Daniken right about now," said the man in the blue dry suit. "I think we should hold off on reporting the inscription," said his partner carefully. "Let's first look for other signs of," he paused, "terrestrial origin. You're senior on this dive, but I agree." The man in blue pressed several buttons on the control panel. "We're on our own now." He stared at the name still visible on the screen. "Didn't expect that from you, Andre." "I have my moments, Dimitri. Now let's find a way in." Sadko turned and moved toward the forward section of the mysterious vessel, buried nose first in the sea floor. Close up, it was clear the solar panels hadn't been the only casualties of landing. The sphere had flattened slightly on impact, but there were no penetrating breaches in the hull. The submersible circled above it and held position a few meters from the ocean bottom. The floodlights picked out a jagged opening in the hull, its torn edges giving it the look of a gaping, prehistoric mouth. A faint metallic gleam confirmed it was a breach, and it was wide enough for Sadko to pass through. Andre nodded silently. Dimitri guided the submersible in. As they entered, the thought crossed his mind that if this was the only breach, the rest of the craft might not be flooded. The walls of the large compartment they'd entered were colonized by tube worms. The submersible's propeller wash startled a cluster of sea spiders resting on the silt-covered floor among twisted wreckage that faintly recalled the decommissioned NASA shuttles he'd seen in photographs. Dimitri directed the beam of a floodlight at one of the broken craft, and on its crumpled wing, letters resolved with painful familiarity. Whatever nation had built the ship whose hangar they'd entered through a breach in the hull, the shuttles that hadn't survived the hard landing had belonged to the American National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Andre swore quietly. "I don't know how this got here," he said. "But why does it say, made in the USA? Whatever the explanation," Dimitri said slowly, "the world has never heard of anything like this. If this is genuinely a product of the American space program, the only rational explanation is that the project behind it failed so catastrophically, or succeeded so secretly, that everything connected with it was either classified or destroyed." The floodlight swept across the tube worm-covered walls and picked out several barely visible doors. Sadko moved to one of them, and the manipulator arm cleared away the growth. A pressure door. Warning labels in English. The logo of the European Space Agency. There was no longer any serious doubt. Whatever had built this vessel, it had been human hands. The manipulator cleared the surrounding wall, and the men found what they had half expected: an emergency diagram. the kind mounted near stairwells and elevators on military and research vessels, showing what was on each level. Dmitri moved to open the door, but Andrei shook his head. There were no pressure suits aboard Sadko. Even if they could force the door open, they couldn't go through it. They had several hours of air remaining between the tanks and the CO2 scrubbers, but all indications were that there was simply no entrance to any other section of the vessel that the submersible could pass through. They would need to report what they'd found and surface. Dmitri reached for the radio. Andrei stopped him and pointed Sadko upward to examine the ceiling of the hangar. Then the submersible lurched and water streaked down the camera lenses. They had surfaced inside the ship. The beam of a floodlight found a railing, a viewing platform of some kind. Sadko moved to it and held position. The men looked at each other. They now had a chance to explore at least part of the mysterious vessel on foot. The only question was whether the air that had remained sealed inside it for all these years was still breathable. The absence of any life forms at this depth that could survive outside water was indirect evidence in their favor, and spacecraft, like submarines, would have been equipped with both stored air and oxygen recycling systems. After some hesitation, they decided to risk it. Emergency oxygen masks prepared, they slowly opened the hatch. The air inside Leviathan was stale, evidence that whatever scrubbing system had once been installed was no longer functioning, but breathable. Most of the ship's systems had apparently continued operating for many years after the crew had either evacuated or perished. Andrei climbed over the railing first and helped Dmitri secure the submersible. Then his partner followed. The unsealed section of the hangar was striking in its contrast to the flooded portion below. At 6,000 meters, there was nothing capable of surviving in air, and the walls and ceiling, as far as their helmet lights could reach, were completely bare. They left the platform. Walking in near darkness, their lights too weak to illuminate the full extent of the hangar, they followed a metal walkway until it brought them to a pressure door. Beside it, a small digital panel. One of them pressed a few buttons. Nothing. Power was cut. He looked at his partner, then turned the light back to the door. Everything about the seal suggested it was hydraulically assisted, which meant that with the ship's reactor offline, the pressure would have dropped enough for two physically capable men to force it. They gripped the recessed handles and pushed. A grinding sound, and the door gave way, opening into total darkness. The ship's diagrams used maritime terminology throughout. The bridge was 5 decks above the flooded hangar. The stairwell was a spiraling tube fitted with handrails and abundant grip holds on the walls, but with no steps whatsoever. Whoever had designed it had clearly never considered the possibility of someone using it under gravity. The climb cost them considerable effort, but they made it. The bridge pressure door yielded the same way as the first. They stepped into a circular corridor whose white walls were covered in long, dried, brownish-green stains. Dmitri wanted to take samples, but Andrei waved him off. They could do that on the way back. The bridge door was open. The viewports were sealed. 2 desiccated bodies lay on the floor. The word "bodies" was only accurate at first glance. The shapes huddled on the seamless floor plates barely resembled anything human. They looked more like some grotesque botanical specimen, a plant that some unknown hand had endowed with the suggestion of animal features. One was spread before what appeared to be a main computer terminal. The other was propped partially against the wall beneath a sealed viewport. Andrei crouched over the nearer shape. Whatever it had mummified completely, and when he touched it, it crumbled to dust. He pulled back sharply. Dmitri stepped carefully around the second shape and began pressing buttons on the computer, hoping to find a power switch. He wasn't optimistic, but the captain's personal terminal had its own battery, and by some miracle, it still held a charge. Loading bars crossed the wide screen in an unfamiliar operating system, but the desktop that appeared wasn't entirely unlike others the men had used. The system language was English. A simple adjustment switched it to Russian. The battery indicator showed no more than 30 minutes of autonomous power. The system clock was several centuries ahead of the current date. That could be partly accounted for by time drift over the years the ship had spent on the ocean floor, but there was almost no avoiding the conclusion. However Leviathan had ended up in the past, it had been built in the future, and only the ship's log could shed any light on how. The log was in a folder on the desktop. Dmitri looked at Andre and opened it. A message appeared. File corruption, offering to attempt recovery. He confirmed. 2 minutes later, the file opened automatically. A woman appeared on screen. Short hair, pleasant face, middle-aged. The recording clearly didn't start from the beginning. She gave no date, only introduced herself as Mary Sunderland, and summarized the mission of Leviathan and the purpose of its voyage. The ship, a joint NASA-ESA project, had been assembled in Earth orbit and designed to test an experimental engine capable of generating wormholes and to conduct reconnaissance of Earth-type planets. The first wormhole transit, though the exit had opened 3 light-years off target, had been successful, and Leviathan had relocated hundreds of light-years from the solar system. Per mission parameters, its radio antennas had been continuously broadcasting into open space on frequencies analogous to those used by Earth's own radio telescopes. The calculations for a new set of wormhole coordinates were nearly complete when an unidentified object appeared on radar, comparable in scale to Leviathan itself. Attempts to hail it produced no response. Captain Sunderland ordered an intercept course to determine its nature. The holographic photographs and video files attached to the log showed a probable extraterrestrial vessel in the shape of an irregular pyramid, slightly flattened along its lateral faces. A preliminary spectral analysis of its hull suggested an alloy based on an element unknown on Earth, with an estimated age of no less than 2 million years. All indications pointed to an abandoned ship. It appeared to drift, carried only by stellar wind. The captain ordered an expedition to board it. The discovery had electrified the crew, though none of them missed the apparent fact that the hull was monolithic. No viewports, no airlocks, no external features of any kind, not even visible seam lines. The alien propulsion technology apparently differed from human technology far more than most science fiction had imagined. The shuttle dispatched for docking had to circle the unidentified object several times, looking for anything resembling a hatch or bay, finding nothing, and then, without warning, panels in the forward section slid open like a predator spreading its jaws. The shuttle requested docking confirmation. No response came. The airlock had evidently opened through some automatic mechanism triggered by the radio signals. The shuttle flew in. Inside, the unknown vessel resembled a vast cave, its walls, floor, and ceiling covered in broad, flattened growths that pulsed in unison every few seconds. Even the dry language of the official report couldn't conceal Captain Sunderland's disappointment. The unidentified flying object was nothing more than a hollow asteroid. The expedition returned with rock and tissue samples from the cave. It was unanimously decided to wait for analysis results before determining whether the find merited further investigation. From this point, the log was severely degraded. Where previously only the date and coordinate segments had failed to recover, now the image broke into static repeatedly, and the audio cut without warning. First, against a frozen image of half her face, the captain, her speech interrupted by a persistent reported an epidemic that had broken out aboard Leviathan following the second expedition to the asteroid. The illness produced sharply elevated temperatures and hallucinations, but no detectable inflammation in any of the infected. What was strange was the hallucinations' uniformity. Everyone on board was seeing the same thing in their fever dreams: Cyclopean cities, their dark towers supporting a sky whose color was unknown to anyone on Leviathan's crew. The visions came from a bird's-eye perspective, allowing every detail to be examined. Yet whenever the viewer's angle shifted, the nightmarish city seemed to shift with it, turning itself inside out. Then the recording dissolved into hysterical "Ah! Ah!" From what could be made out, the woman screaming deeply regretted her choices and would never have agreed to set foot aboard Leviathan if she could go back. The audio cut abruptly. The image returned, and the men stepped back from the computer. Mary Sunderland's pleasant face was covered in deep lesions, their edges hardened into something resembling scales or tree bark. Unfamiliar words kept breaking into her speech. The changes, it soon became clear, had spread across her entire body. In addition to the skin lesions, her fingers and toes had begun fusing together. Attempts to separate them accomplished nothing. Similar mutations were affecting the whole crew. Everyone reported partial but steadily progressing memory loss, accompanied by the emergence of alien recollections composed entirely of imagery with no human reference point. Meanwhile, the asteroid, which the crew had initially mistaken for an extraterrestrial ship, had begun changing shape. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but now the transformation was unmistakable. The irregular pyramid had become an almost perfect cylinder, resembling a giant capsule, and it was following Leviathan, closing the distance steadily. A frightened Captain Sunderland pushed the ship to maximum speed. The pursuer kept pace. The screen went dark. The stunned researchers assumed the recording had ended, but then sound returned first. Inhuman voices, as if chanting some grim hymn in an unknown language. Then the image appeared again. Whether this was Mary Sunderland or something else, it was impossible to say. The figure on screen, covered in what appeared to be gray scales or bark, had nothing human in its face. It was barely recognizable as a face at all, until a lipless mouth opened. A horizontal split in what the captain's face had become. The creature's speech was initially indistinguishable from the chanting that had preceded it, only more disjointed. Then, English words began to appear in it. The men could make out that it couldn't remember the date or its own name. Gradually, the speech became more recognizably human, though the flat, emotionless voice made clear the effort each word cost. The entire crew of Leviathan had lost all human appearance, transforming into something more plant than animal. The object they had mistakenly identified as first a spacecraft and then an asteroid had almost caught them. Its forward section had opened into an enormous maw. The crew had encountered an extraterrestrial life form so alien to humanity that communication was simply not a possibility. Then the audio dropped, but the video continued. The thing that had perhaps once been Mary Sunderland leaned over the computer and entered a command. A moment later, the screen announced a complete battery failure and shut down. The men stared at each other in the dark. The most likely conclusion was straightforward. At some point during the final sequence, the captain, in a last moment of clarity, had tried to take Leviathan out of range of the predatory living ship by entering random coordinates, or simply activating the wormhole drive and letting the navigation computer decide. An error had sent the ship back in time and deposited it on the ocean floor of the solar system, where it had rested until a military submarine found it several centuries later. The fate of the pursuing entity was unknown, but the most reasonable assumption was that it had either remained in deep space where Leviathan had first encountered it, or had followed the ship through the wormhole and found nothing worth its attention in the solar system of that era, assuming, of course, that it was the radio signal that had drawn it in the first place.
"This is insane," Andre murmured, wiping cold sweat from his forehead.
"Insane," Dmitri agreed.
"But we both saw it."
He looked at the body by the terminal.
"You wouldn't wish that on anyone."
Andre walked the length of the bridge. "All right, say it's not insane. Then I still don't understand one thing.
How did whatever this was manage to spread through the whole ship? I seriously doubt the expedition members skipped decontamination protocol, and the lab would have had quarantine procedures.
No one knew what they were dealing with, Dmitri said, still looking at the body. If this organism was capable of surviving in open vacuum, its mutagens may have been resistant to any sterilization method Leviathan had available. What concerns me right now is a different question. How safe is the air we are breathing?
Andre froze, his hand going involuntarily to his throat.
Bacteria and viruses can survive as spores for hundreds of years. So it's entirely possible that the mutagen, if that's what it was, is still viable and we're already infected, Dmitri finished.
The ship wasn't sealed, Andre said without much conviction.
If the mutagen were still active, it seems strange it would still be contained inside Leviathan. You saw how much marine life is out there?
Fair point, Dmitri nodded.
I think it's time to go back. The question is, what we tell them. Everything. All of it. There's no reason to withhold facts. Though I strongly doubt any of this will ever be published. They left the bridge and headed, as they believed, back toward the stairwell. But the corridor stretched on unexpectedly. When it became clear they had taken a wrong turn somewhere, a flashlight beam picked out a wall plate. Research Laboratory Section. The men stopped. I'm very much hoping there are computers in here with backup power, Andre said, and pushed the pressure door open. It gave easily. Dmitri shook his head and followed. The laboratory rooms lined both sides of the corridor and extended above and even below it. The men checked each one, looking for a server room that might give them access to the full research archive. The corridor curved, and through a round doorframe, a large oval hall opened before them. On its floor, in identical postures, lay several dozen monstrous shapes. The former crew of Leviathan in their final arrangement. In the center of the hall rose a barely luminous, transparent construction, something formless shifting and pulsing within it. The researchers entered the hall without fully realizing they had begun moving on tiptoe. What had looked from a distance like a glass cage turned out to be a metal cube with no visible faces, only edges, electric arcs jumping between them at intervals. Inside, a dark substance moved from corner to corner, constantly changing shape. The men stared at it, transfixed. Then strange images began appearing in their minds. First, something like an electric discharge that vanished abruptly. Then, what appeared to be an instrument panel. And when they tried to focus on these images, to understand where they had come from, the meaning broke through with sudden, terrible clarity. Something was demanding they cut the power to the electromagnetic cage. Who are you? Andre thought, and his mind was immediately flooded with cascading images. First came the vision of a cyclopean city from the log, the city whose geometry violated everything he understood about three-dimensional space. Then the image dissolved, and he was suspended in star-filled void, not alone. All around him pulsed the life of other monstrous entities, capable of any form, capable of consuming anything, organic or inorganic. Their consciousness, one shared thing, each of them feeling itself and all the others simultaneously. They moved through infinity, consuming everything they encountered. When they found organic life, they established a telepathic connection, altering the genetic structure of whatever they touched.
Those organisms whose biology allowed it were remade into things like themselves and absorbed into the collective. Those that couldn't sustain the change degraded into twisted mutations, condemned to a slow extinction, if they were fortunate enough not to simply be consumed. The images came so fast and so completely that the man barely managed to remember he was still a separate organism. He found the presence of mind to ask one more question. "Where are you from?" Knowing the thing couldn't understand his words, but hoping it could read the mental images he involuntarily attached to them. In response came the answer he half expected. They had been drawn to Leviathan by its radio transmissions, and had established the telepathic link during the first human expedition into their interior.
But before the genetic rewriting had progressed far enough, the humans had extracted one of the entities from the collective body, without understanding what they were handling. Images of the crew's mutations swept past, followed by Leviathan diving into a wormhole and the collective ship plunging after it, only to vanish into a black hole that formed and collapsed in the same instant. Then the demand returned. "Cut the power to the cage!" He felt his own body begin to move toward the control panel without his consent. For a moment, he seemed to watch himself from outside. Broke through the trance. He looked frantically for Dmitri and saw him walking with the jerky movements of a puppet, arm already extended toward the switch. Andre threw himself at his colleague and knocked him away from the panel. Dmitri struck the edge of the cube. The moment he made contact, his body arched under a massive electric discharge. An instant later, he was thrown back toward the hall's entrance. In Andre's mind, chaotic images flashed. Everything the thing in the cage apparently believed had frightened him. Pinching his own cheeks hard enough to bruise, making sounds he didn't recognize as his own voice, he ran from the hall without stopping to check whether his partner was alive. He ran blind through the laboratory section, the images in his head accelerating, now mixed with his own worst memories. The thing had no way to understand what it was seeing in a human mind, but its sensitivity to electromagnetic signals let it read the physiological response to any image it produced. It could identify the worst ones, the most frightening, and use them. The thoughts running through Andre's head converged on a single conclusion. Cutting the cage's power would make it stop. If he hadn't already fled the hall where the crew's mutated bodies lay around their imprisoned god, he might have done it. But the fear was driving him forward, and only forward. He ran what felt like the longest corridor in the ship, tripped, and hit his head on the floor. Ugh. The sharp pain cleared some of the images. He lay still for a moment, then forced himself upright and shone his light around. A small room, a single panel, or perhaps a secondary computer terminal. Moving on instinct, he switched it on the same way Dmitri had activated the captain's terminal. When the operating system loaded, he understood where he'd ended up. The fear had driven him all the way to the aft of Leviathan. He was standing at the backup control station for the experimental wormhole drive. The screen displayed the ship's status. The fusion reactor still held enough energy to generate a wormhole. A thought passed through Andre's mind. If he attempted it, even the brief interval of transit would be enough to drag the surface ship down. He couldn't say with certainty whether that was his own reasoning or a threat sent by the thing in the cage. And the suspicion that it was the latter was what hardened his will. Preparing the drive proved simpler than he expected. After a brief consideration, he selected as destination coordinates the first set stored in the navigation history. From behind the bulkheads came the deep hum of the drive building power for the wormhole. At that moment, the nightmarish images that had not left him for a moment
abruptly ceased. The reason wasn't hard to guess. Someone had cut the power to the electromagnetic cage. The only person who could have done it was Dmitri, if the thing hadn't managed to take control of a dead body. Andrei hammered at the keys, trying to accelerate the countdown. A moment later, unbearable pain tore through his consciousness. The entity, before abandoning its prison, had apparently decided to kill the one who had defied it. His awareness was fading rapidly, but in the last instant before it went out completely, he felt the ship begin to move, accelerating toward the unknown. Whether Leviathan ever arrived anywhere, and what became of the entity it carried, those questions have no answers. The research vessel found no trace of the submersible or its crew. The ocean floor, when surveyed again several weeks later, was empty. No wreckage, no debris, no sign that anything had ever been there. The official report cited equipment failure and unexplained loss of the vessel. The classified addendum has never been published.